to quote a saying of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, who asked, "Shall I not tell you something that is better than fasting, prayer, and charity?" And he said, "Peace and reconciliation between people." So that takes us to this evening's topic. Jonathan's going to be speaking on personal, national, and international security. He's going to focus on applying the golden rule to personal, national, and international relations. It seems that so often we're more critical towards others than we are towards ourselves. And often this also plays out politically on the global stage. We're more critical of other nations, and we expect more of other nations than we expect of our own nation. Recently, Jonathan stated 9 nations claim that nuclear weapons are legitimate and good in their hands, but decry the spread of these weapons to others. Is this a sustainable solution? Is it consistent with the golden rule? Now to our speaker. Mr. Jonathan Granoff is president of the Global Security Institute and United Nations representative and senior advisor of the Permanent Secretariat of the World Summits of Nobel Peace Laureates. He chairs the Task Force on Nuclear Non-Proliferation of the International Law Section of the American Bar Association, and he is a fellow of the World Academy of Arts and Science. He has testified as an expert before the U.S. Congress, the United Nations, Canadian Parliament, and UK Parliament. And in 2014, he was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Jonathan Granoff.
That was a lovely introduction. Thank you very much. And the music was absolutely intoxicating. I think that the mixture of cultures creates a special. And Morocco is a bridge between tradition and modernity, a bridge between East and West, between Africa and Europe, and a bridge between the past and the future. And it's my prayer that the people of Tasawwuf, the people of unity of man and God, which is so rich in the tradition there, and the fragrance of that spread in the way your music spreads to our hearts. Shukran. Thank you. And I want to thank Sam for inviting me here. What an amazing place, a place in which not only the body but the spirit can be nourished. You can sort of feel just the people that work here, they welcome you with such enthusiasm. And so it's a wonderful thing you've created, and I hope it grows. And Zach, thank you so much for seeking me out and inviting me here. It's an honor to be here. This is really quite a special place. A hub, as it were, where things can come together. So that's sort of what I want to talk about, is the coming together between values and policy. And I've been thinking a lot about this, and so I'm going to sort of experiment with some thoughts and then get some feedback from you. I was thinking of writing a book or some articles about this. Values have to be the compass point for policy. You could have a policy that was clear with values, but not practical. But the idea that you could have a policy that was practical, but incoherent with values, could be very dangerous. In other words, you can end up with improved means to an unimproved end. And I would say nuclear weapons very much fit into that category, because they decry all basic human values: the sacredness of life, the security of nations, the very future. So to let you guys know exactly where I'm coming from, I'm going to quote George Kennan. George Kennan. Does anybody here not know who George Kennan is? Okay, well, George Kennan was the architect of the containment theory of the Cold War. He's associated with being the most important political philosopher of American policy of the 20th century. And he's normally associated with the traditional political philosophy of realism, of looking at power as the essential foundation of the legitimacy of the state. And he said, the readiness to use nuclear weapons against other human beings, against people we do not know, whom we've never seen, and whose guilt or innocence is not for us to establish, and in so doing to place in jeopardy the natural structure upon which all civilization rests, as though the safety and perceived interests of our own generation were more important than everything that has taken place or could take place in civilization, this is nothing less than a presumption, a blasphemy, an indignity of monstrous dimensions offered to God. So I agree with him. And I agree also with George Shultz, who was the Secretary of State when Ronald Reagan was the president. And he was very instrumental in helping to end the Cold War. And he said recently, this is a publication from the Yale Divinity School, and it's available on the Global Security Institute's website, the whole publication. It's really quite something. Yale did a big conference on the subject. The world is trending toward an increase in danger from nuclear weapons. So parenthetically, the US government, every 5 years there's a thing called the Nuclear Posture Review. And the Nuclear Posture Review that just came out for this administration, first it expanded the role of nuclear weapons to include as a deterrent relating to cyber issues. It affirmed the first use of nuclear weapons as a policy, not only as a deterrent. And it pledged in excess of $1.2 trillion. I want that number to sink in. That's real money. $1.2 trillion to modernize the arsenal and make it more usable, which of course is going to be mirrored by the other states with nuclear weapons and waste huge amounts of resources, not just intelligence, but resources of human interaction. The opportunity costs that will be presented, but the amount of money is huge. So Ronald Reagan had a very simple equation once he learned a little bit about nuclear weapons, which was a nuclear war can never be won and therefore must never be fought, and that was his guidepost here. So this is George Shultz I'm quoting. That trend must and can be turned around. Support is building. Doable steps toward the goal of a world without nuclear weapons have been identified. Attainment of the goal is a real possibility. And so I'll just substantiate that. In July, 122 nations voted on a treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons. There are 5 nuclear weapons-free zones in the world. 115 countries are in them, making the Southern Hemisphere virtually nuclear weapons-free. Latin America, Central America, and the Caribbean was the first to do that. It happened because Brazil and Argentina were going down the path of a nuclear arms race, and Mexico, a great ambassador there, Ambassador Robles, stepped in and said, why don't we create a nuclear weapons-free zone? So now there's a nuclear weapons-free zone of Latin America, a nuclear weapons-free zone of Africa, so there's no nuclear weapons in Africa, a nuclear weapons-free zone in the South Pacific, a nuclear weapons-free zone in Central Asia. And they have beautiful names like Tlatelolco, Rarotonga, Pelindabra. Finally, and the first resolution of the General Assembly of the United Nations was to get rid of nuclear weapons. And it's a legal duty under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. That's part of the bargain of the treaty. It's a legal duty. And the International Court of Justice in recent years ruled unanimously that there's a duty to negotiate the elimination of nuclear weapons. What's astonishing is how little coverage this gets in the media, how little Americans know about how many nuclear weapons we have, how big they are, what they do, and I'll talk a little bit about that. Finally, from a personal perspective, I will do everything I can to turn possibility into reality. I've been touched by this issue almost from the day the first atomic bomb was exploded. I remember vividly the pictures of a devastated Hiroshima. I served alongside President Reagan as we were responsible for national security. Who is the human being with the right to use a modern nuclear weapon, knowing the awesome human consequences? Ronald Reagan believed that nuclear weapons are immoral, and so he sought their complete elimination, and I agreed and still do with deep conviction. In the end, this is a matter of profound morality. So the organization that I'm the president of was founded by Senator Alan Cranston, the distinguished senator from California, and Mikhail Gorbachev, who believed, and I quote, nuclear weapons are unworthy of civilization. Again, a moral, values-based analysis. If you take the moral analysis out of policy, you end up with taking out the purpose of what a society should provide its citizens, which is an enabling environment to become human. And when you take purpose out of institutions, you run the risk of mistaking the how for the why. So this is a large problem of modernity and a large problem in our society. So I'll give some examples. The purpose of capitalism is to provide capital for goods and services. But now we have capital as an end in itself. The purpose of philosophy is to pursue truth. But philosophy now is about philosophy, how it's taught in our universities. The purpose of medicine is healing in all of its dimensions. The purpose of law is justice, not procedure. I've been a law professor off and on, and it's so interesting. You can get a doctorate in law without ever taking a course in justice. The purpose of religion is love and transcendence. Not rites, rituals, and practices are the how, but the why is love and transcendence. But so much religion is focused on the how, forgetting the why. And the purpose of weapons is to enhance security. But nuclear weapons are completely the opposite. The more the weapon is perfected, the less security is obtained. Because there's very little discussion about the why. And the why has to come based on values, based on deeper foundation. So in today's world, there is a set of existential threats of a global nature that require global cooperation to address. I'll name a few. Phytoplankton rests on the health of the oceans, and our health as human beings rests on the health of phytoplankton. 50 to 70% of our oxygen comes from this single-celled organism in the oceans. And the phytoplankton depends on the acidic-alkaline balance of the oceans. And with global warming, we're throwing this off kilter, and we don't know what the consequences are. We know that there are dead zones in the Pacific larger than the state of Texas that are appearing now. And we know that the protection of the oceans cannot be done at a national level, because if one nation is outside of the regime, dumping can be done through their flag. So you need a global regime. We're all familiar with the dangers of the climate, I'm sure, but it's happening faster than people realize. We're destroying rainforests faster than they're being replenished, and that's about 30% of our oxygen comes from, you can conceive of the rainforests as the lungs of the planet. Because of this, pandemic diseases are being predicted, and these don't carry passports or recognize borders. The topsoil in much of the world is being depleted faster than it's being replenished. And the water tables, for example, in South Asia are being depleted faster than they're being replenished. Now, these are not ideologies. These are not partisan issues. This is science. This is real. And these issues require cooperation. Now, what's interesting is the business community has figured out how to cooperate. I remember there was a period I was a franchise lawyer, and just to franchise in the United States, you had to go through 16 different regimes because you had different states had different franchising regimes, plus a federal regime. So you had 17 regimes you had to come into compliance with. So it was very difficult to do it. And to franchise globally, the administrative costs and legal costs were extremely high. Today, franchising is extremely efficient globally. And you can write a letter of credit in Kuala Lumpur and be confident that it's going to be honored in Santiago, Chile, or in London. That the financial community has figured out laws and rules that integrate finance and productivity in a seamless global web. And that includes China and Russia. And that includes the fact that we use China as a bank and that Europe uses Russia for fuel. The reality of the business world is that you can also have confidence that the rule of law will apply to your contracts globally. It used to be that if you had a judgment from the highest court in Canada, you couldn't enforce it in the United States because a local judge would open it up based on procedure. But now the business community has figured out by putting arbitration clauses in contracts, you can do commerce globally. So in a very short period of time, without complex state intervention, the business community has integrated capitalism globally in an efficient, just way. And it works. And we all benefit from that. The problem with it is the purpose of law is the application of justice. And justice is a public good. It's not a commercial good. It's not a private good. But justice has been privatized. So the business community has found a way of having justice in their contracts so they can rely on the flow of capital. But there is no commensurate justice for criminal conduct. The International Criminal Court does not have plenary and compulsive jurisdiction, nor does the International Court of Justice. And there's no court to protect the environment. And there's no international court to protect labor rights, children's rights, human rights. There's no human rights court. So justice, which is essential for civilized behavior, the application of justice, third-party intervention in disputes, has now become commercialized because we forgot the why of the whole thing. Because we're not having a discussion of what are the ethical norms that we need that law rests upon, because law without ethics always leads to tyranny, and what are the ethical norms that need to be established for a global order that has law. Now it's interesting that all of the great wise from time immemorial have asserted that the human family is one, and the importance for personal spiritual growth to see the human family as one, to see all human beings as part of one's own family. In fact, in the Quran, it's even God in the first person says, I'm all awareness and all knowing, meaning when you look in the eyes of anybody, that awareness is part of God. And therefore you have to treat them with inherent dignity, inherent respect, inherent sacredness, that every human being is as sacred as you are. And we created the nation state to stop the religious wars of Central Europe in the 17th century, to protect people. And we created nuclear weapons to protect the state, to protect the people. General Lee Butler, who was head of all nuclear weapons in the United States, said, "Despite all the evidence, we've yet to fully grasp the monstrous effect of these weapons, that the consequence of their use defies reason, transcending time and space, poisoning the earth and deforming its inhabitants. Nuclear weapons are inherently dangerous, hugely expensive, and military inefficient." General Butler was head of the strategic command, head of the targeting, readiness, and the entire operations of our nuclear arsenal. That's who I'm quoting. General Butler stated that accepting nuclear weapons as the ultimate arbiter of conflict condemns the world to live under a dark cloud of perpetual anxiety. Worse, it codifies mankind's most murderous instincts as an acceptable resort when other options for resolving conflict fail. I have spent years studying nuclear weapons effects, have investigated a distressing array of accidents and incidents involving strategic weapons and forces. I came away from the experience deeply troubled by what I see as the burden of building and maintaining nuclear arsenals, the grotesquely destructive war plans, the daily operational risks, and the constant prospect of a crisis that would hold the fate of entire societies at risk. And I would say that the continued neglect of protecting the climate is of equal consequence. And what they both share is a disregard for our responsibility to future generations. And they both share a fundamental ethical analysis at their core. So I'm going to propose two principles that, when applied to our personal lives, bring coherence, inner peace, justice into our lives, and provide the receptivity for the blessings of the divine to come into our hearts and our lives and our families. And these are things that you probably know, but there's no harm in reminding ourselves. Because truth is found in remembrance as much as in acquisition. So, the first one, I think, is universal, and I'll demonstrate its universality. Buddhism: hurt not others in ways that you yourself would find hurtful, the Undana Varga. Christianity: all things whatsoever you would that men should do to you, do you even so to them. Matthew. Confucianism: do not unto others what you would not have them do unto you. Analytics. Hinduism: this is the sum of duty. Do not unto others that which would cause you pain if done to you. Mahabharata. Islam: no one of you is a believer until he desires for his brother that which he desires for himself. Hadith. Jainism: in happiness and suffering, in joy and grief, we should regard all creatures as we regard our own self. Lord Mahavir. Judaism: what is hateful to you, do not do to your fellow man. That is the law. All the rest is commentary. Talmud. Zoroastrianism: that nature only is good when it shall not do unto another whatsoever is not good for itself. And when the list goes on. Now, why is this? Does this come from religion? No, it comes from the very architecture that God made human beings. It comes from our humanity, which of course comes from the divine. Religion is a way of expressing it and reinforcing it and enabling it and reminding us, but it comes before that. It comes before creation. It's part of the makeup of the soul, because when you look at the people that articulate it, they all ground it in the experience of the unity of life and the unity of being. In other words, the great sages are people who realized that they were waves, part of a greater ocean. It's ironic that we often identify ourselves with the wave and forget that we're actually part of the ocean. Because when you realize you're part of the ocean, you realize you have responsibility to the other waves, because they're part of the same ocean. So one of the names of God is Hayat, life. So all life is sacred. All life is part of the ocean of the divine. But the wave only realizes that it's part of the ocean when it bows down, when it has humility. Then it realizes its true nature. And man is the same way. The human being, I didn't mean man. The human being is the same way. So this is a universal principle that people from time immemorial have understood and realized. Imagine tomorrow that you live the day without any recognition of this. You just live completely selfishly, without caring for the well-being of anybody else. Just, you don't restrain your anger, you don't restrain your selfishness. You just treat people as a means to your most selfish ends. Imagine how you would feel in bed that night, all by yourself. And then imagine the next day you treat everybody as part of your family. You treat everybody with as much loving kindness and mercy and forgiveness and goodness and helping them like they're your closest family. You just express as much love and kindness as you possibly can. Celebrate the beauty of everybody you meet. And just imagine how you would feel that night. So the first instance is what the victors did after World War I. They applied a selfish analysis and put crushing reparations on the German people. The consequence was the chaos and whirlwind of Nazism. After World War II, wise generals who had seen and who knew about nuclear weapons, knew about the atomic bomb, and had seen the carnage and the suffering that war brings, instituted the Marshall Plan, which was an expression of generosity and forgiveness, and built the economy and social fabric of Germany and Japan. The consequence being wealth, security, and great pride in being an American. The application of a spiritual principle in global affairs. The same principle that makes us happy as individuals made us happy and successful as a nation, and caused others to want to emulate us. I would propose that we should have as a rule of political philosophy, nations must treat other nations as they want to be treated. Judge Christopher Wiramontre, I think one of the great jurists of our time, was the vice president judge of the International Court of Justice, said, "Equality of all those who are subject to a legal system is central to its integrity and legitimacy. So it is with the body of principles constituting the corpus of international law. Least of all can there be one law for the powerful and another law for the rest. No domestic system would accept such a principle, nor can any international system which is premised on a concept of equality." So nuclear weapons, 96% of them are in the hands of the United States and Russia. There are only 9 countries with the weapons. 5 of them are parties to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and have a legal duty to negotiate their elimination. That's China, Russia, the United Kingdom, France, and the United States. There are 4 countries outside of the regime: Israel, Pakistan, India, and North Korea. For them to say these weapons are good for us, but not for others, is practically speaking like a parent smoking a cigar telling his teenagers not to smoke cigarettes. It's impractical and unsustainable. But I think that underlying it is its violation of this ethical principle we call the Golden Rule. Because these ethical principles are practical. They work. That's really important. Because human beings are ethical creatures, and if we deny our humanity, we suffer. When we affirm that which makes us human, our ability to love and care for one another, we succeed. The hub will succeed because its inspiration is based on helping and serving and ennobling people. You read any of the great capitalists, Andrew Carnegie, any of these guys, they understood that if you produce something that serves people, you're going to succeed. If you produce something that people don't want or need, you're not. Unless the only other way you can succeed is by the corruption of distorting the welfare of the state, which is what I think the military-industrial complex that General Eisenhower, President Eisenhower warned us about, is doing. So much money, so much money. $1.7 trillion last year. So the global Marshall Plan that all the nations of the world have agreed to are symbolized by this. This is the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which all the nations of the world agreed on at the UN, which includes education for all, gender equity, protection of the climate, advancing human rights, just all the things that really bring security to people, ending poverty by 2030, all the things that really bring security. So that's one principle. The other principle is, I guess we would call it service. I guess we would call it service. So in Matthew, Jesus says, he who would be great would be he who would serve. And there's a story of the devil tempting him. You know, you can have the whole world. He rejects it. There's also a hadith where the Holy Prophet Muhammad, may blessings be upon him and all the prophets, and all of us too, when there's a hadith to the effect that the devil tempts him and says, you want to be the king of the world. And he says, no, I want to be a servant. I want to be a servant of God. So you hear the name, and I can see many people are familiar with this, of servant of Abdul Rahman, servant of compassion. So this is a way of asserting the dignity of serving one of God's qualities. In Matthew also, Jesus talks about evaluating the quality of your service. And he says, I was hungry, did you feed me? I was hungry and you fed me. I was naked and you clothed me. I was in prison and you visited me. And then all the disciples, the apostles say, well, we never saw you naked and hungry and in prison. And then he said, well, what you do to the least amongst you, you do to me. And then he talks, the only time you see fire and brimstone in the Bible, he says, this is what you're going to be asked about on Judgment Day. How did you treat the disenfranchised? And Gandhi said that the way of evaluating whether a policy or something you want to do is good or bad is to put in front of you the face of the most disenfranchised, poorest person you've ever met and think, will this be a benefit or burden to them? And the Prophet Muhammad, when he was in Medina, he wouldn't eat until everybody else ate first, because he viewed himself as a servant. So this idea of service, and the Bhagavad Gita, the great Hindu scripture, describes different ways of coming to union with the divine, and one is by devotion to God, another is by contemplation of the nature of consciousness, and one of them is called karma yoga, which is to engage in service without expectation of reward, selflessly. So they're all kind of movements from the love of self to selfless love. Because selfless love is the nature of God's love. It's just generous. He doesn't ask anything from us. It's just given. We're just given life. We're just given love. We're just given our lives. It's not a deal. It's a gift. It's really different. It's not a deal. It's a gift. So now, when the nation serves its people, or a nation serves the people of the world, it is fulfilling its purpose. When it becomes the security state and the purpose of the state is itself, it becomes a burden to the people. And the brilliance of the United States is that there were enough people who created it who understood this, who understood this brilliant notion that the legitimacy of the state comes from the people. Those who are governed give the state its legitimacy. I was in Russia a few years ago, and I was asked to advise civic chamber. It's a part of the government that licenses civil society. And the head of it said, Mr. Granoff, I want to ask you a question. We have learned the vibrancy of civil society in America, how important it is. And we are so proud. We have licensed over 200,000 civil society organizations since the end of the Cold War. I want to know, how do you ensure that civil society is of benefit to the state? And I said, I have no idea. I have been active in civil society organizations my whole life, but it's the other way around. It's to ensure that the state is of benefit to the civil society, because the state is the employee, the people are the employers. The state's duty is to serve. So here we have this principle of service as divine instructions and examples of the highest human beings we know of. Jesus, Muhammad, Gandhi. These are people who attained stations of spiritual and human awakening or blessing with Jesus. That in the Christian tradition, he is the manifestation of God himself. And in Muhammad, he is the witness for the nature of God. And in Gandhi is Gandhi, okay? But the point of the matter is, you can look at it in your own life. You can look at every mother, how they raise their how they raise a child, how they suffer to give birth. But as soon as that child comes out, they would give anything to protect that child, and any good parent would be that way. That's what makes a family work, that sense of service and sacrifice. That knowing that a giving of yourself is what gives you real peace. People get married today like a deal. They don't and they end up getting divorced because they want to get another deal. We have a president who has marriages. He's had marriages like used cars. We get a new one. Because it's clear that he doesn't understand the principle that sacrifice, the root of sacrifice is the sacred, that sacrifice allows you to bring your activity into the sacred. So the state, which rests on law, has to rest on these ethical principles. If you look deeply at the principles of the United States, its creation, there were real wisdom in it, a real sense of, it's the first time a group of testosterone-driven men give away power, distribute power. Washington could have been a king. They helped create checks and balances because they knew that without that wisdom, the quest for power would overcome the good. So they created law. We're the first country created based on the rule of law. And the United Nations is also a legal creation. And I want to end about the importance of international law and international cooperation based on these principles. First, there are universal principles. The Declaration of Human Rights is not culturally relative. It rests on these same principles, the dignity, inherent dignity of every individual. And there's never been a person who's been tortured who said human rights are culturally relative. It's only torturers who say that, or they're relative to time and circumstance. No, human rights are sacred. And it says, actually, that we are endowed with inherent dignity. It doesn't say where they come from, which is, they don't want to have a debate about God, Allah, Yahweh, Krishna, whatever you call it. But there's a recognition, a universal recognition of the inherent dignity of the individual person, which means you can't violate that. You can't torture them. You can't deprive them of their dignity. In the United States, we have a Constitution, and there's a portion of the Constitution, Article 6, Clause 2, that says that treaties are the supreme law of the land. It's called the Supremacy Clause. The United Nations Charter is a treaty. So I'm actually offended when I see the press talking about the deal with Iran which was adopted as a Security Council resolution. It's not a deal with Iran. It's a Security Council resolution. So when the president talks about not liking the deal, he's essentially saying, I'm disregarding the Constitution, because the UN Charter gives the Security Council the responsibility and the power to compel states all over to do something. And it also grants the United States and 4 other countries a veto power to not allow those resolutions to go forward. So there was a resolution that the United States, as an entity, put forward called the deal, the JCPOA with Iran, which was adopted unanimously by the Security Council, unanimously, and the president talks about it like it's a deal. You just walk away from it. And that derides the rule of law. And that derides our human purpose. And that derides our national purpose. And that breeds insecurity. So I'm going to finish and maybe get some feedback, because it's my belief that truth and values have to apply at all levels. That they have to make sense personally, family, community, nation, world. And I've found 2 of them. And I'm going to keep looking, because I believe that there's more. I believe there's more ethical fabric that needs to be brought into the public discourse. This is the first time I've ever talked about this, and I hope it makes some sense, because I think that the public discourse has allowed the so-called realists to say it's realistic to rely on nuclear weapons. It's realistic to continue with our economic system that treats the natural world as if it were infinite when it's not. And a culture in which selfishness is treated as if, like Ayn Rand, selfishness is treated as a good. I think we can do better. I know too many people in my life who've done better, and I feel I'm in a place that's an expression of something much better. Thank you. I've learned that prayer is very valuable, that we need to recognize that we're part of a greater power than our own individual lives, and that we're gifted with so many breaths, so many heartbeats, so many moments, and that we need to call upon that greater power with gratitude, and that the consequence of prayer, the evidence of prayer, is the opening of the heart, and the evidence of the opening of the heart is loving kindness and compassion. And the evidence of compassion is caring for others and working to eliminate their suffering and to help other people. And the evidence of helping other people is a clear conscience. And the evidence of a clear conscience is inner peace. And the evidence of inner peace is a sense of gratitude and prayerfulness. So it's kind of like an ascending spiral. But it begins with the intention to know. It all begins with the intention to know the mystery of life and to not just treat life as a theater or as a shopping center, but to really delve deep into, like, what am I here for? Who am I? Where am I going? How can my life have meaning? It begins with that. And then, and then if you knock on that door, and you pray, you need to ask for help. You need to ask for help. If you do that, then that power that gave you life will also help open your heart. And then then you'll get love, and then with love and caring, you want to help other people. And then if you do that, then you get a clear conscience, because you can either have the dynamic of trying to get it for yourself, getting, or the dynamic of giving, of sharing, of creating movement, of creativity. Great entrepreneurs are creative people. They're creating things in the business world. Artists are creating. There's a sense of giving. And if you're giving, you're forgiven. If you're all about getting, you're forgotten.
Thank you. I mean this spiral you describe is it's moving and it's brilliant. Was that an inspiration that you received or something that you learned from someone else? This a sort of.
I definitely learned it from experience. I tried it out. I wouldn't have said it if I hadn't tried it.
Yes. And is it unrealistic to hope for the golden rule to be applied in our political systems? Can we see, this universal political philosophy that's based on loving kindness and treating others, across races and religions and so forth, but also other nations as ourselves?
Well, equality under the law is a foundation of justice in any system. So this is not some great, some pie in the sky idea. It is the guiding principle of our domestic system of law. Now, do we always do it? No. I mean, we have an outrageous incarceration rate of our black population. So either we're putting a lot of innocent people in jail, or we have a societal situation where we're producing a lot of criminals. Either way, it's unjust. But the principle, the guiding principle, the goal, the point of reference has to be put forward. The ideal has to be put forward. If we don't put forward what our principles are, then we just have total chaos. Now, the fact that we fall short just shows that we're human. And it's humbling. But it doesn't detract from the importance of putting the principle forward. The fact that we're unable to always live up to it doesn't mean you throw out the principle. And even if, we wouldn't throw out, so we talked about the higher, but let's take the lower. The fact that there are still murders, it doesn't follow then that we should throw out prohibitions against murder because the law is not perfect. Similarly, the admonition for the higher, because we don't always reach it, you don't throw it out. We need to keep that ahead of us and to keep that goal ahead of us. And what you'll discover if you do that is a sense that you can't do that alone, that you need to pray for help. And that's why all of the religions include prayer, in the sacred. Modernity is a little bit enamored by the power of the intellect. And the intellect's very powerful, but the intellect can't know the self. The intellect can't know its own source. It takes wisdom for that. So if we neglect the admonition of the wise, we would be very foolish. So I'm only suggesting that we take the statements of the wisest of our species and try and apply them across the board and see how it works. And then I've looked at history and seen that when those principles are applied, there's great success. And when they're not applied, there's chaos.
It has been said that we get a president that we deserve. I wonder how we got this way, because I think our current administration is a reflection of some people's belief systems, that America has to be first before anybody else can come and be equal with us. I guess I'm fearful about where we're headed. I hope to have hope, but I am concerned. And I sometimes wonder, how did we get this way? How did we get this way?
Well, first of all, he had less than 30% of the population voted for him. So a lot of people just sat out. So I think apathy is a big part of it. That number one. Number two, he lied. He said he posed as a populist, but he wasn't. Number three, the Russians helped. Number four, Cambridge Analytica helped by putting out an entire fake creation. And number five, I think the liberal establishment pretty much ignored the extraordinary suffering of a large portion of America. And that can't be done. So hopefully this is a wake-up call and a lesson that, that people will get engaged and repudiate these values. And this idea of America first, it's a weird, it has a resonance of the people that support, who destroyed the League of Nations and so forth. But it's a strange perspective given the history of America, which was we were created in response to the arrogance of an overreaching empire based on the principle that those who are governed can hold the government accountable. And that was a principle that they wanted to spread. So, in the 1790s, we even had the Alien Tort Claims Act, that we wanted to make our courts of justice that would be a model for the whole world. So this idea that we would become an empire ourselves is very strange. And on the other hand, for some people, they voted for him thinking that he was an isolationist, that we would pull back our 700 military bases and not have adventures abroad. So on the one hand, he was saying, he got elected saying, we're going to dominate the world. On the other hand, we will pull back from the world. It's utterly incoherent. My difficulty is this. I'm a student of political philosophy, and I taught international law and legal philosophy professionally, so I know a lot about it. But I never came across any political theorists who analyzed governance through spectacle and P.T. Barnum. It's just taken us by surprise. So it's extraordinarily dangerous. Madeleine Albright's written a book about the potential of creeping fascism. I think that the president has exemplified extraordinary arrogance. He doesn't read briefs. He's derided the criminal justice system. He called a federal judge, a so-called judge. He's legitimized prejudice, racism, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia. He's increased our military budget, our militarism. He's decimated the State Department, our diplomats. His utter disrespect for women is shocking. What can you say? It's frightening, and I think it should be more than concern. I think we all have a duty to not allow it to slide any further, and demand of every politician that they repudiate racism, Islamophobia, oppression, gender oppression, the degradation of the rule of law, and the very simple contract between those who govern and those who are governed, which is at least telling the truth and respecting that there is such a thing as truth and truth-telling. And we have a president who clearly doesn't have an idea what truth is. He changes daily. So it's tremendously dangerous. And that's why I think that's why I've started this. I'm a full-time activist working on preserving the non-proliferation regime and working to get rid of nuclear weapons. But right now, the very institutions upon which any civilization can rest are at risk. So I'm now decided that I'm going to devote a lot of time to these deeper ideas and looking for these ethical principles that are being corroded. Because I've been looking at the intelligentsia is dealing on such a superficial level, almost the level of name-calling. And I think we've got to come back to these deeper principles. So that's what I'm doing, because I'm basically an intellectual and an advocate, a public advocate. So that's what I'm going to try to do, and gather other people to do like-minded things. I've spent the last 15 years of my life working to strengthen the non-proliferation regime, working with countries to come up with policies that constrain the spread of nuclear weapons, that reduce them. And we've reduced them by 80%. We only have about 14,900. We had over 60,000. Some people say it was up in the 70s. But we've reduced the number enormously, but still way too many. Less than 200, less than 150 could end civilization. But I've been working with nations and diplomats The United States doesn't have diplomats now. We don't even have an ambassador to South Korea. We don't have an assistant secretary of state for nuclear nonproliferation. I mean, they're not there. The State Department's been decimated. And I think it's largely because people don't understand what's really at stake. And I think what's at stake is more than just our country. It's the very values of our civilization. It's serious.
There seems to be a propensity towards atheism and agnosticism these days. A lot of your talk was enshrined in spirituality. With this sort of inclination that we're seeing in the society, how do you think that is going to impact our world for years to come? And secondly, is there a better alternative to imperfect democracy? Is there anything else out there that you would think would could rival it? Thank you.
Well, constitutional democracy is really important because democracy, which is just the rule of the popular, will ultimately cause the oppression of minority points of view. And the minority could be just one person, you know. So constitutional democracy is really important. So constitutions are real important. So that's what I think is better than just democracy. Democracy as an end in itself is not enough. There has to be checks and balances even on democracy. But I think that what's happened is I'm trying to say this in simple. First, I'll say it the way I really think of it, which is the epistemological tyranny of empiricism, which is the reduction of truth claims to only that which can be seen, felt, measured, and predicted, is an inadequate explanation of the human experience. That human beings need values. We are value creatures. We're moral creatures. Whenever a war is done, the people who are perpetrating the war on all sides invoke love in order to get young men to go and fight and have families give up their kids. Love of family, love of country, love of the brothers with whom you're fighting. And yet when we talk about love, they're not as spiritual idealism. So the difference is they're using love in a vain way. And if God is love, they're violating one of the 10 Commandments. They're using God's name in vain. They're using it selfishly. I think people like you and I, we need to talk about love as universal. Because if we don't, if we allow the public discourse to be reduced to pure utilitarianism, which is what you're talking about, then in the vacuum, fundamentalists are filling it. In India, the Hindutva are filling it. In the Middle East, Wahhabism is filling it, or Ayatollahism. In America, we've seen extraordinary Christian fundamentalism in the most weird, spiritually distorted thing, where you people are, they're saying that God put Donald Trump into the presidency. He's the chosen one. I mean, people are saying, these guys are saying this. He got the fundamentalist vote. And they reach people at the level of those values, but they say they're their values, not God's values. They're not universal. They're just ours. They're just for Americans. They're just for Christians. They're just for, you know, and each of the groups claims it that way. I'm saying they're right about the values. They're wrong about who owns them. We don't own them. If you think you own the air, just hold on to it for about 5 minutes and see how well you do.
Well, thank you very much. I just learned about this program mid-afternoon today, and immediately jumped and came here to hear you. I'm so happy.
Thank you.
George Schultz and others in this book, they really talk about very clearly.
What I can't see the book.
Oh, it's the war must never be fought.
Oh yeah, with Jim Goodby.
Right.
He's in my organization. He helped create the bipartisan security group with me.
Right.
So
Jim Goodby.
Ambassador Jim Goodby.
I just sent him a note saying that I am listening to you.
Oh, really?
Yeah, right. I did.
Synchronicity.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and in the dilemma of nuclear deterrence. They're really brilliant here. They really talk about it very clearly.
Chapter 15.
Right. So on President Obama 2009, either endorsed this in Prague or whatever, came up with a brilliant idea, U.S. is going to get rid of it. Then his own Secretary of State, Ash Carter, I don't know whether you read the Politico this a few months ago. He is the one who actually really debating we need that $1.2 trillion for modernizing.
Yeah.
So what is going on? I mean, I can't believe that the Secretary of Defense is talking about this, and the president, was he able to convince President Obama to endorse this? I mean, what went on?
Well, within a month after, so people don't know. So you're obviously an expert in this subject. Oh, thank you. That's fabulous. Thank you. Yeah. So the book he's referring to is a book by George Shultz and Ambassador James Goodby. Ambassador James Goodby is one of the programs that I helped start is called the Bipartisan Security Group. And Ambassador Goodby is one of America's most distinguished diplomats. It's interesting that people know about generals and basketball players and football players and rock stars, but they don't know about diplomats. Diplomats are really, really important. I mean, they're the ones who speak on behalf of our country to other countries, and Ambassador Goodby is one of the great ones. I mean, he was instrumental in helping end the Cold War, and he's just a brilliant man with the kind of qualities that we're talking about. So President Obama gave a speech in Prague in 2009 in which he put forward the moral imperative of pursuing a nuclear weapons-free world. But within like a month, the Strategic Command had a major conference affirming the values of deterrence. And when he didn't fire anybody, I told everybody that he's not going to be able to do it, and we need to understand that. And so yeah, the establishment of the military-industrial complex just prevented him. And Ash Carter's now he's now head at the Belfer Center at Harvard. I just wrote Graham Allison a letter, and he said, no, I'm no longer doing it. And Ash Carter should have known better because he was very much a student of former Secretary of Defense William Perry. And I want to commend everyone's attention William Perry's book, My Journey on the Nuclear Brink. And if you don't feel like reading, just Google me, Jonathan Granoff, and William Perry in the Vimeo. I do these dialogues in front of the American Bar Association. They're actually good. The last one I did was with Dan Ellsberg, who just wrote a book called The Doomsday Machine, because he helped create the whole program, which is, if we have a nuclear war, we plan on ending the world. Just period. That's what the plan is. And the Russians have the same plan. And it's just totally unaccountable power. It's just a small coterie of generals and technicians who control this. I can name names. It wouldn't mean anything to you because they're not public. They're not hiding. They're not hiding like some secret conspiracy. It's the Strategic Command, and they're very smart, but they buy into this. Their framework is the security of the state, not the security of humanity, and that's the problem. Because I think you have to start with truth. The human family is one. The purpose of the state is to bring security. It's not that the purpose of the people is to secure the state. It's the purpose of the state to secure the security of the people. And this is where we've gone wrong, I think. Yes, President Obama wanted to make progress. He did make progress. He accomplished the START Treaty, which brought us down to lower numbers of deployed weapons to 1,500 on both sides, and increased the inspections. He created the JCPOA that could have stopped Iran's program, but now that's been thrown out. He did a lot of good things. He brought some sense of dignity back to America. He didn't start, and he changed the dialogue from what's our next war, which is what we're dealing with now, to how do we provide health care for the people. Those are very good things. And he broke a racial barrier that nobody could conceive of a black American being president. So I think he did a lot of really good things and brought some degree of dignity to the office. But no, he did not make the progress that we had hoped for in nuclear weapons.
Okay. Thank you for a very inspiring speech. I have a question for you. I think that one distinction which I think is important, I didn't hear from you, with regard to nuclear weapons possession, and that is between democratic countries which basically want to uphold the status quo and other non-democratic countries which want to destroy the status quo. For instance, when Sweden for a while worked on a nuclear weapons program, I don't think anybody in the world lost sleep over that. Today, Japan can have a nuclear weapon arsenal within days, perhaps. I don't think anybody loses sleep over that either, because it's also a status quo country. But North Korea with nuclear weapons, if it does not create fear in the world, it should create fear in the world, as is the case with Iran, which openly calls for destruction of another country and was working on nuclear weapons and perhaps will work again on nuclear weapons. So I think this distinction is important, especially since those countries like North Korea and Iran have been cheating in the past and are likely to cheat in the future. And my great fear is, suppose even there is a non-proliferation treaty that actually is mostly implemented and most countries actually implement it, but then the countries that cheat are precisely the North Koreas and Irans, and they're the ones that are left with nuclear weapons, and I don't want to even think about my grandchildren living in this kind of a world. So how do you deal with that distinction, which to me is really very frightening if you ignore that distinction? Thank you.
Well, to quote the Secretary General of the United Nations, there's no good arms for bad arms. So the arsenals of any of those states, that the rogue states you're talking about, well, there's only one of them really, is North Korea, is not existential. And they would be suicidal to use them. And if, as Bill Perry said in answer to your question, in such a world that you described, that there weren't any nuclear weapons, if some state had squirreled away a handful of them, first of all, it wouldn't be existential. And second of all, the countries that had given them up could bomb any such country back to the Stone Age in an afternoon. That's North Korea, for example. Their nuclear weapons are useless to them. They're of no strategic value, they're psychological value. Weapons of mass destruction, the United States provided chemical weapons to Iraq, which were used wantonly on Iran. So I don't know how responsible we were when we did that. The other point is that any country, there's two issues with nuclear weapons that I find really hazardous. One is oops, and the other is bozo. So let's deal with oops. Oops is when somebody puts a training tape in the computers in Cheyenne Mountain and it looks like there's a full-scale Soviet launch against us. And the President of the United States, to quote Ronald Reagan, has 6 minutes to decide whether the fate of the world, whether the world will exist or not. And that's insane. And if it wasn't for some wise people calling the radar facilities to see whether there actually were bombs coming in, we might have had the end of society. Or the time that William Perry talks about, we put a computer chip in one of our satellites that wasn't programmed to distinguish between a sunrise and a nuclear launch. Wow. And Brzezinski almost called President Carter saying there was a full-scale Soviet launch. Turned out it was a computer chip. There literally, I could go on all evening about these mishaps like this. In 2003, there was a French and English nuclear submarines collided in the North Sea. Collided. I mean, the statistic about this is minimal. That's, oops, computer era. And that's becoming increasingly dangerous as we rely more and more on computers and they're faster. The other is bozo, which is on any given day, well, there was one instance in which there was a weather satellite launched off of Norway, and the Norwegians told the Russians so they wouldn't mistake it as a Trident launch, but it didn't go up to command and control. So Boris Yeltsin had about less than 10 minutes to decide the fate of the world. And he decided that it was okay because he knew that Clinton wouldn't launch nuclear weapons. But he was an alcoholic. Like alcoholic, I put that in the bozo category. And I don't have any trust in the balance of Donald Trump. And I don't have any trust that within 100 years that the people in the United States couldn't elect somebody worse than Donald Trump, who somebody who wants to bring Jesus back, or any country that sees, we'll bring about Qiyamah as fast as we can, we'll bring the Mahdi back. These eschatologies that are, or the Hindutva, the radical party, radical Hindus, who are not afraid of dying. Remember, the nation state was created because Protestants and Catholics were willing to die for their belief about whose definition of Jesus' love was better. And if it wasn't for a bunch of wonky lawyers in Westphalia who stopped the fighting, they would have just continued. There were, Central Europe had a third of the population wiped out in the 17th century from these religious wars. So I don't trust, any people to be good and pure forever. So I don't see it as like just them. There is no them. And that's why I don't think these weapons should exist. The Pope has a good analysis on this. Now, in the 1980s, the Holy See's analysis was there's a legal commitment and a moral commitment to get rid of them, but deterrence is an interim step pending abolition. And it's legitimate. And then they started questioning it, saying, well, the disarmament process is not taking place. But Pope Francis recently came out and said that deterrence rests on the credibility and readiness to launch. And to have that credibility, you have to train thousands of young people to be ready to launch the weapons, to be ready to end humanity, to turn the entire planet into a wasteland. And he said, there's no way you can morally justify making people ready to inflict that kind of carnage. You realize nuclear weapons are, what was dropped on Hiroshima is relatively small. It was 15 kilotons. We have weapons in the megaton range. The Soviets dropped a 50 megaton bomb, tested a 50 megaton bomb. That would be over 3,000 Hiroshimas. Most of the weapons in the arsenal are 20 to 30 times the size of Hiroshima. The triggering devices are what we had in Hiroshima. An 800 kiloton bomb, and as it explodes, the heat is 4 to 5 times the center of the sun. Within 1,000th of a second, it reduces to 3 times the heat on the surface of the sun. And then there's a fireball, about 16 miles in radius, with winds 600-700 miles an hour. I mean, you can't imagine the destructive capacity of these weapons. That's just one of them. That's just one. One dropped on San Francisco. We'd be gone here, just gone. But there's thousands of them. There's 14,900 of them. It's insane. So it's oops and bozo. So I don't look at them, I look at the human condition.
I worry about the power of the military-industrial complex. Is it realistic to think that we are really going to make changes when they have so much power?
Yes, it is, because there are many people in the military, who, like General Mattis, for example, who would have never gotten this position if he wasn't called Mad Dog Mattis, who said that the military budget should be reduced and we should increase our diplomats. He actually said, if you reduce the money for diplomats, you need to give me more money to fight wars. But I agree with you that it's really, let me give you an example of why I agree with you. So the Joint Chiefs of Staff did a study on climate change when Obama was president, and they concluded that the greatest threat to our security is climate change. And then they said, we need more money to fight the wars that will occur because there'll be resource wars from the, so I looked at that and said, that's kind of like saying, the steering wheel on my car is loose, book me a room in the hospital. instead of saying, let's mitigate climate change, their solution is their military solution. So I think they have a right to be at the table. But when they become the guiding institutions, it's really dangerous because they only have one tool. And they know that. And there's a lot of generals that know that. And in fact, in this administration, it's been the people from the military who've been pretty much the checks and balances that we have because they know the cost of it. I totally agree with you that the distortions of the framing of issues. I was just with a producer on MSNBC last week, and I said, why do you never have international lawyers on your show? Why do you always have retired military people talking about these international issues? Aren't we a country based on the rule of law? I'm the chair of the Task Force on Nuclear Nonproliferation of the International Law Section of the American Bar Association. Why don't you have people like me on? You know? And he said, well, we don't have you on our list. And I said, well, look at your list of experts. It's all from the think tanks funded by the military contractors. Yeah, it's very serious. That's why people like yourself have to step up and support people like me who are the voice for law, diplomacy, and civil society. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Yes, the amount of money is astronomical. I mean, our military budget is equal to the next 23 countries combined. So they're either getting more bang for their buck or we're just paying for pork barrel. Absolutely, it's a complete, that's why I say but for me, to argue guns butter is a loser. Because in the places that matter, the argument goes as follows when you argue guns butter, meaning we should take the money for schools, roads, hospitals, and public welfare rather than the military. They argue the precondition for social development is security, and military brings security. We need to make the argument that this is the wrong bus, that they're not bringing security. Their invasion of Iraq did not bring security. The war in Vietnam did not bring security. The invasion of Afghanistan does not bring security. It's just the wrong tool for these tasks. There are not military solutions to these problems. And that's the argument that has to be made. And I totally agree with you. We need to challenge the paradigm and make it an issue that people will vote on. Right now they're voting on sex and taxes. We need to make a vote on reality. Reality matters. And values are necessary to unpack reality, because that's what we are. That's what it is to be human, is to come back to these values that we know in our hearts are necessary. That's what we've lost. And I think it's on us. It's on us to do this. This is what we have to do. That's what I'm dedicated to do. And I know a lot of people who get this. Thank you. Thank you for letting me share with you.
بجاح 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 ولا بغى يرتاح ما عبد غير نواح هذاك مرادو هذاك مرادو نايم في الدنيا لا تكون مروم راه الدنيا فايتة فايتة محمد أزكى السلام أنام سلام عليك يا رسول إله 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 من يدي لا إله إلا الله لا إله إلا الله لا إله إلا الله ربي تسير قيوم يا ذا الجلال والإكرام صلوا 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 على أشرف المخلوقين وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما لا إله إلا الله لا إله إلا الله لا إله إلا الله رب ربي تسيبه لا إله إلا الله لا إله إلا الله لا إله إلا الله رب ربي